Welcome back to the We Who Thirst podcast, where Jesus is the living water and it is we who thirst. You can support this ministry by joining our Patreon. Our current series is Women in Context, a deep dive into the lives and stories of the women of the Bible in their cultural, familial, and historical context. Welcome back to the We Who Thirst podcast. I took a few weeks off from podcasting over the Christmas break, and I am so excited to be back with you. Today, we are jumping right back into our Proverbs 31 series that we had to pause back in September. So if you're just tuning into the podcast now, you may want to go back and listen to episodes 5 through 7 of the podcast, where we laid the groundwork for how to read and understand Proverbs 31 and who the woman of valor is. Today, we are going to be specifically talking about God's heart for women, the woman of valor in her home, and how that relates to the modern idea of homemaker or tradwife. With me today is my dear friend Elise Kilko. She is a stay-at-home mom of 2 beautiful kids who also volunteers at a Bible school helping behind the scenes with childcare and reception. She's also a foreign worker who has lived in 3 different countries for extended periods of time, interfacing with a variety of cultures. Elise, our topic today is about the woman of valor and her home. Whenever we talk about the home, the topic of homemaking and evangelical complementarian expectations for women comes up. What is your experience with teachings on homemaking?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think having been in so many different cultures, I grew up in Brazil, and there really, unless you're quite, upper middle class, you will probably have a job outside the home.
Okay.
And if you are upper middle class, that means you had the means to get an education. And so you might still work outside the home. Frequent professions for women are dentists, lawyers, really anything, but teachers, some of the same ones that often women gravitate to here in the States as well. But I think growing up, I understood that the woman might need to be, she's working at home. Her value is to be helping at home and kind of be in charge of who's doing what at home, but that she might still be outside working a profession outside the home as well, because it needs to happen if the bills are going to get paid.
Yeah.
And so then coming to college in the Midwest in the United States and getting into all the very complementarian, very Baptist
You went to a
teachings.
fundamentalist adjacent
Yeah,
college.
yes, very much so. Then having kind of to rewire wait, but what if you have to work outside the home? It was almost like a culture shock.
Yeah.
And so I think I've seen a lot of different perspectives of what homemaking could be. I'm thankful that I've seen so many perspectives.
Yeah. I think what you bring up with the different cultures is really important, and we're not going to get into that real deeply this episode, though I would like to on an episode at some point. But I've heard, I know Jasmine Holmes talks about this as well, just the different cultures even inside the United States. Historically, Black women have had to work outside the home for many of the same reasons that Brazilian women have to work outside the home. And how so much of the homemaking as a woman's role culture really is white, fundamentalist adjacent, fundamentalist evangelical culture. It is very middle class. It is very white, this expectation. But for those of us who have engaged that culture or who come out of that culture, this expectation that women be a homemaker is the status quo in the church.
Yeah, that makes sense.
In preparation for this episode, the last couple of days, I did some informal polling on my social media platforms. So the results are very much whoever was on yesterday, whoever either follows me on Instagram or randomly came across the posts on Threads. So but the results were really interesting. The results of the informal polling that I did showed that 50 to 61% of the women who were polled were taught in their churches that a woman's role as ordained by God is to be a homemaker. So 50% or more women have been taught that a woman's role is to be the homemaker. I believe about 13%, 10 to 13%, their church didn't even talk about it at all, what a
Oh,
woman's role
wow.
was. So you either have you're to be a homemaker or silence is kind of, and then about 30%, no, that's not her role.
Yeah.
Interestingly, though, even though the churches are teaching seemingly overwhelmingly that a woman's role is to be a homemaker, very little specific instruction was given on how to be a homemaker in the church. The majority of women were just left to figure that out on their own or talk amongst themselves or read books, blogs, etc. The church itself didn't give them help on how to do that. They were just left to figure it out or told that they needed to focus on their husband and kids. A theme that I know I was taught and I was hearing from women who were DMing me or answering my polls was that they were taught their job is to make their husband a success. And they can only do anything outside of making him a success or taking care of their house if they have accomplished making him a success and taking perfect care of their house. Only then can they follow any of their own interests or passions or callings.
That's so much pressure.
Yeah. Yeah.
So much pressure.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And so they didn't get a lot of specifics. It's kind of vague, but they're told to focus
Yeah.
relentlessly here, but not really told how. Have you experienced any of these kind of firm but vague teachings?
Yes. Yeah, for sure. Growing up, our kind of niche Baptist group had a women's meeting every year. And so there would often be breakout sessions, and sometimes those breakout sessions would be a lot more practical. So, kind of
Hmm.
some of these, how can you get an actual thing done?
Yeah.
But a lot of times they were very vague. It was a mixed bag, a mixed bag of like, this is what you need to do without any concrete steps. But I do remember sometimes having very concrete, breakout sessions of like, here's how you could do a specific thing.
Hmm.
Um, but then here in the States, I mean, I was a biblical counseling major. Yay. So I read just about every single book about Christian homemaking and Christian counseling from the years, 80s through 2009 or 10. So that gave me a whole bunch to think about and
Oh,
baggage
yeah.
that I am now trying to sort through, I guess.
I find it really interesting how the local churches didn't do a whole lot of direct teaching, especially from like the pulpit, but women
Hmm.
were encouraged to go into all of these books and blogs and side teachings, typically from other women, that often ended up being very unhealthy.
Hmm.
And I think sometimes from conversations I've had with like my dad, who's a pastor, or other pastors, they're not even aware fully of what some of these women are being taught because it's outside it's the pastors aren't really paying
Yeah.
attention to what the women are doing. And that's a whole side conversation that we're not going to get into. But it's back to the poll. Unsurprisingly, the majority of the women I polled struggled in their homemaking. About a quarter of those said they didn't feel like they did well or felt well as a homemaker. A majority of women felt like they did not live up to the expectations that their communities and churches had for them as homemakers, leaving
Mm.
over half the women feeling like a failure or perpetually guilty for their performance, that they just weren't measuring up. It's like this rat race where they could never do good enough. A very small percentage, like 14%, felt like they thrived as homemakers. About a quarter of the women didn't even try to be homemakers. But the rest of them either struggled but did okay or just did not feel like they did well as homemakers at all. And what I found most interesting is that even women who no longer believe that God commands women to be homemakers, because that's a strong teaching, you have to be a
Mhm.
homemaker, this is God's will for your life. Even women who do not believe that God commands them to be homemakers still feel either high to extremely high levels of guilt about their homemaking.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the shame we carry from the things that we were taught or we picked up. Yeah, your polling sounds, I mean, it just really, it's, I can definitely see that in my own life and in those of my friends. Homemaking in the, white American evangelical fundamental framework is very isolating. It can be really hard unless you are one of the few that thrives on,
Mhm.
making all the lists and being the one that's writing the blog and teaching other people how to do it. And
Mhm.
even those people, I imagine if you had an honest conversation with them, not every day would be rosy.
Yeah.
So, it's really hard, just the pressure that we feel to live up to this expectation without clear directions. Like you
Mhm.
have this huge expectation with no clear direction on how to meet the standard, which
Yeah.
is so, so hard. And then you read Proverbs 31 and you are taught that it's a checklist and you're just destined to like fail.
Yeah.
You're going to fail.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so like, and even when you are given a checklist, those checklists don't necessarily fit your family or your family dynamics. Um, and then you're again back to the idea that you have to be totally consumed with your family.
Mhm.
Um, Dorothy Patterson, who was the wife of the president of the seminary I attended, told me once that a married woman has to be a stay-at-home homemaker trying to have children, even if she can't, that needs to be her goal. And if she is working outside the home, it is because she and her husband have a lack of faith. So
Where does
basically, if a
that
woman who is married of childbearing age is working outside the home, she is in sin and has a lack of faith.
Where does that leave all the single women, all the women who struggle with infertility or
Well, those
any kind of health issue or,
those women get a pass because they don't have kids. I was recently married at the time, expected to start popping out babies, but you're allowed to work if you don't have kids. But if you are fertile and able to have children, you better get to it.
oh, so hard.
But the other women are still expected, single women, women without kids, they're still expected to be homemakers while they're working a job. They're now
Hmm.
expected to do both simultaneously.
Hmm.
And they would often frame homemaking a lot around hospitality, especially for the working women, like the single women and those without children. Like Dorothy was working because her children were all grown. Um, but for me, as I think about that, when you start making homemaking about hospitality, why don't we just call it hospitality that both men and women are responsible for?
Hmm.
But there was just this expectation. Let me read to you what Dorothy Patterson wrote in Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, because I think this kind of encapsulates some of the teaching many women have received. She says, these characteristics describe God's ideal woman in Proverbs 31. She is a committed homemaker, a chaste helpmeet, upright, and God fearing woman of strength. There is no hint in the passage that this woman has any other purpose than to meet the needs of her family in the best possible way.
So I'm just a baby making machine who is a servant.
For your family. And that is not to denigrate homemaking or taking care of your family. Every
Yeah.
woman I know, whether she is working in or outside the home, is trying to take care of her family in the best possible way. Um, but the homemaking discussions in the white evangelical fundamentalist adjacent circles centers on the woman only and primarily doing homemaking. And they root that in passages like Proverbs 31 and Titus 2, so that authors like Debbie Pearl say, Young women are to be keepers of the home. This is the sixth of 8 mandates for young women in Titus 2. It is not a suggestion, it is God's will for wives,
She says.
she says in her book, Created to be His Helpmate. And so you have
Oh,
extreme pressure that you have to do this. God created you in the womb. If you have the privilege of marriage to be a homemaker, there is no other option. And this is a theme that comes up in all sorts of books for women, which are the primary teaching women are getting on this topic is from books. I've seen themes like this echoed in Rebecca Merkel's Even Exile. I saw even the Kostenbergers alluded to some of this in their book on men and women. I don't want to focus on all those teachings, but I do want to lay a framework for our discussion that a lot of us are coming out of circles that emphasized those teachings very strongly.
mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely sets us up for failure and for a lot of pressure to be put on us, which then in turn gives us shame when we
Mhm.
can't attain the standard that's been set.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of the standard that's been set also revolves around the people in your life. And
Mm-hmm.
your children have to behave a certain way. Your husband has to view you a certain way. So, for many, and I'm not going to say all, and this is not taught explicitly as much as implicitly, but for many homemakers, they can only feel like a success when the people around them in their home are happy, well behaved, and fulfilled, leaving
Mm-hmm.
homemakers with an intrinsic need to control all the people in their lives because their success depends on everybody around them looking just so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's so hard.
And then when you're dealing with families that have trauma, neurodivergence, all medical issues, a lot
Mm-hmm.
of that starts really fracturing because you cannot meet the ideal, which is where I think a lot of my followers especially come because I have a very large number of neurodivergent women or women with neurodivergent kids.
Mm-hmm.
And when you start dealing with these extra things, medical, neurodivergence, trauma, all of that, you suddenly the ideal of children who obey the very first time and husbands who lead and are happy to see you and all of this, it starts kind of splintering, but you're
Mm-hmm.
supposed to be the homemaker. You're to
Mm-hmm.
make the home, and that includes the people being happy, and you can't do that. And so that's why I think my polls reveal such immense levels of guilt these women just carry all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes total sense. Oh, that's so hard.
Yeah, it really is. So, um, there are some teachers, and the Kostenbergers fall under this, that do give some leeway for women to work outside the home. Not
Mm-hmm.
every teacher in these circles says women have to work completely inside the home. Some say they can work outside the home, but it's kind of she's supposed to work inside the home, but if she has to, she can work outside the home. But it's kind of this muddy position. Like, at what point am I okay to work outside the home or I need to, or what point not?
Yeah.
Have you run across that
Yeah,
position and
totally.
how did you process?
Yeah, it's like, okay, do I stay at home and take care of my family and go on food stamps, or do I get a job outside the house? Like I know for a lot of people that was like a decision they had to make. And then you put in, if you're in a specific group of people who are going to look down on
Mm-hmm.
people who have to go on food stamps, then all of a
Mm-hmm.
sudden you're trying to keep that a secret,
Mm-hmm.
and that
Yep.
adds more shame to the system. So yeah, I definitely saw it was like working outside the home was like this loophole if you need it for finances, but at what point is it a need and at what time is it a want? Like,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
definitely, and different people measure that at a different way.
I
So,
got a DM from one woman who had a very interesting insight. She said that in her church, if a woman wasn't a homemaker, that opened up her life to be scrutinized. And now everybody's like nitpicking her life, either to justify her needing to work out the home. Oh, her husband just doesn't have a very good job, or he's disabled. So now they're nitpicking her husband. Or they're scrutinizing her family for being too worldly in their spending habits.
Mm,
Oh,
that's so
they
hard.
just she wants to work outside the home because they have cars. They don't need two cars that are that nice. They could have less nice cars and she could stay home. And so the whole homemaking thing leads to a lot of scrutiny, not around things like the fruits of the spirit in a First Corinthians
Yes.
13 love, but around like just nitpicky life things where people are judging. I think that can become, unfortunately, a huge part of this culture of nitpicking women's choices
Yes.
and trying to judge motives, which also adds to all that guilt and shame.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Part of what I really want to do in this series, though, is lift some of that guilt and shame off. I want to look at how God views women, and what God is calling women to do and to be, looking specifically at the passages that in some ways have been used to bludgeon women in the
Mm-hmm.
past. We are focusing on Proverbs 31 in this series. I will probably at some point do an episode or two on Titus 2. So we're going to leave Titus 2 for another time. But I do want to talk in detail about Proverbs 31, this woman in her home. So for today, we need to back up a little bit before we get into Proverbs 31 proper and talk about a woman's role in the Old Testament. For a full, huge discussion on that, I have a lecture on gender roles and patricentric hierarchy on my YouTube channel. You can search for We Who Thirst podcast on YouTube. You can watch that. That'll, with pictures and diagrams and the whole 9 yard, walk you through.
And it's so good. It's so
Yes, family
helpful.
social structures in the Bible, not just the Old Testament. But we'll summarize that here today. So, Elise, what were you taught about the family structures and roles of women in the Old Testament growing up?
That's such a good question. I was thinking about it earlier today. I was actually talking with my sister because how we were taught about it as kids and then changing countries
Yes.
and then how you view it as an adult is so different. And I think growing up, my dad has six sisters. He's the only boy, and then he got married and had four daughters. And praise the Lord, he values women. We would really, really be in a bad place if he didn't. But I definitely think that carried over into how he taught us about women in the Bible, because it was important to him that we were valued and that we saw our place in God's story. And that definitely came through growing up. So growing up, I didn't just learn about, the meek and timid women of the
Mm-hmm.
Bible. I learned about the warriors. I learned about Jael and Deborah, Abigail, who saved her whole household from slaughter. And those were my heroines. Like, I learned about the value of a woman's place who could make judgment calls and go to battle and be strong and follow God, not just because her husband was going to the temple and making sacrifices, but because she in her own home was welcoming in angels and
Mm-hmm.
making meals for them and all of that. And so I'm so thankful that I caught that vision very early
Yeah.
from
Yeah.
my parents, and I realize now as an adult just how unusual that was.
Yeah, because some of those women, you're rattling off women, and I remember teachings about them from a very firmly complementarian space where the wife is to submit to the husband. He is the boss. He is the military commander. When he says jump, she says how high. Um, a wife is only as obedient to God as she is as obedient to her husband. Those are the types of things that we're taught. And so women like Abigail, who went around her husband to give David the food, was actually kind of looked down on. She wasn't a
Yeah.
heroine. We're all like, how could she be that disobedient? And
Mhm.
so it's beautiful that you were taught the beauty of these strong women, but it doesn't sound like you were taught a lot specifically about how these women functioned in family structures and roles.
No, not necessarily. No,
Okay.
not as you teach it
Okay.
from, historical context.
But, and this is kind of a side note, but I think a lot of what you were taught is kind of the Jewish perspective. They have a slightly different, the Jewish perspective of women is very different than the complementarian perspective of women.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think you were able to absorb more of the Jewish perspective, looking up at and honoring these women, than the
Mm-hmm.
complementarian. She needs to submit and obey her husband, period, end of the
Yeah.
road. If the lights get turned off in the house because he's not paying the bills, she just needs to pray and let God handle
Mm-hmm.
it and submit.
Yeah.
So social structure in the Old Testament. One thing I want to talk about that I think we deal with when we're talking about homemaking specifically is the idea of public versus private space, and what space women occupy. And a lot of this comes down to how the ancient people viewed public versus private space and the modern ideas of public and private space. When you think about public and private space, Elise, what aspects of life would you put in each today for modern sake?
Today, yeah, for most modern families, like jobs would be outside the house
Public.
and cooking, cleaning, laundry would be inside the house. If you're on a committee or volunteering or you do some sort of job, that would be outside. Whereas if you're, doing other things, that would be inside the house.
So really private space is inside your personal
Mhm.
domicile, your house. Public
Yes,
space is everything out there.
outside. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is not how it was. So
Not
can
how it
you
was in the
break
ancient
that
world.
down? Can you break that down for us, how it's
Yeah.
different then?
So in the ancient world, religion was kind of considered both public and private. Certain parts of the religious and Israel were certain part of the religious observance were public, like going to the temple,
Mhm.
those sorts of things. A lot of religious observance were private, and they were actually things that women did in the home. So religion is kind of both and, which is really important to understand when we get to talking about the New Testament, which we're not doing today. So I will
Yeah.
not digress. I will stay on topic. So religion is both public and private. But really, for the ancient peoples, and especially the Old Testament, the only things that were considered public space were politics and the judiciary. Everything else was considered private space. So politics, who the king is, the leader of the tribe, all of that, that's kind of public space. Think the meeting at the gate. We hear in the Old Testament,
Mhm.
they would meet at the gate. That is like public space. The
Mhm.
political judgment areas, judiciary, that's public space. Private space is everything else. Commerce, production, markets, economy, social relationships. That is considered private space. In the Old Testament, the home was the economic center. So our modern idea of a separation of, you immediately said work, going to your job
Mhm.
is outside the home. That's public space. In the ancient world, there's no separation between your home and your vocation, your work. So your vocation, your production, your economy, you earning, they didn't necessarily, especially in the Old Testament, worry about like earning money per se. They
Mhm.
were less of a money-based society and more of a good trading type society. But your economy is all centered in the home. There is no separation of, oh, she works outside the home, public space,
Mhm.
versus working in the home, private space. Work is private
Mhm.
space in the ancient mindset. So our idea of a homemaker as a adult human who limits themselves primarily, though they do obviously venture out into public space, but they limit themselves and their focus primarily to private space, which is the house itself. In the ancient world, a woman, though most women did function in private space, their private space was much larger.
Yeah, and you can kind of see this throughout history. I mean, basically up until the Industrial Revolution.
Exactly.
If your family were farmers, you were farmers. If you were shopkeepers, your house was above the shop or very close
Exactly.
by. If your family was shoemakers, you were shoemakers. So it's not so, I mean, it's still there, not so
Yeah.
far back.
It's not that far back, but in the homemaking circles that really push this idea of homemaking, they have this huge split. They're very much the man is the
Hmm.
provider. His God has called him to provide, and he has called the woman to be the homemaker, which is splitting the economic and the homeward function in a way that the ancient peoples in either the New Testament or the
Didn't.
Old Testament, they would have been like, what are you talking about? These are like everybody in the family,
Intertwined.
everybody in the family does both. We
Yeah.
take care of the house, the household, all of that stuff, and the economy. Um, Women didn't frequent public spaces that often. Most rulers and judges were men, but we do have examples of women in the Old Testament, like Deborah and Jezebel, and there was other queens as well whose names I'm forgetting. Bathsheba. They also were in public spaces, so there was a time and place for women to be in the public spaces.
Mm-hmm.
Though most of their daily life, especially when you're just dealing with the average woman, was in the private space. And when we talk about the average person, most of the average men are functioning completely in private spaces as well, because they didn't necessarily have ruling or judicial functions in their community. They might be representing their family, but they didn't have those high up positions.
Mm-hmm. Unless they're going to go get their exchange of land switched through the Chamber of Commerce, quote unquote,
Right.
things
Yep.
like that. Most of them are outside as well. Yeah, that's so interesting.
And so this is what I find super interesting about modern complementarian writings about homemaking, because as I've read Debbie Pearl, Rebecca Merkel, these sorts of authors, they really consider homemaking to be a position that chiefly occupies the modern idea of private space. And they are very strong in their expectations for a homemaker to primarily stay in the home itself, which is, as we talked about briefly earlier, extremely isolating. Women are encouraged. They're Authors like Merkel and Pearl strongly discourage women from socializing with other women or being on their phones or joining community causes or anything that takes them away from focusing purely on their nuclear families. It is you, your husband, and your kids. That is to be 100% of your focus. And a lot of these complementarian teachings, when in the Old Testament, we see women had a much broader focus. Unlike what Dorothy Patterson said, the Proverbs 31 woman wasn't only concerned about the needs of her nuclear family.
So bring us back to Proverbs 31. What does that have to do with the homemaker, the woman of valor as a homemaker?
Yes. Well, when we get into Proverbs 31 itself, just to review for those who are just tuning into the series and haven't had a chance to go back and listen to episode 5 yet, we are reading in this series on Proverbs 31 the passage to see various things that God delights in women. We are not reading Proverbs 31 as a checklist for the ideal women. I got several comments that I was always taught Proverbs 31 as a checklist, a list of to-dos for the modern homemaker. That is not how God designed Proverbs 31. This proverb was probably written by a mother as advice for her son on what to look for in a queen. Her son was a king. This is what you look for in your wife. So the activities shown in Proverbs 31 are not the average day-to-day activities for the normal peasant woman. That's really important to understand.
Super important. Yeah.
This is not what the average Jane was doing every day. This passage describes the life, and it's more whole life, not like her day to day, but like a holistic look of 30 to 80 years of living to describe the life of a godly, wealthy woman with incredible privilege. She is a privileged woman. This passage praises the good qualities of the woman of valor, the Proverbs 31 woman, and that praise reveals some of the aspects God delights in women, but it is not an exhaustive list.
Which is so important and
So
takes so much pressure off.
it does, because it's not a to-do list. These aren't things we have to emulate. It's saying in this culture, these are things this type of woman did. A wealthy, aristocratic, privileged woman did these sorts of things, and those show us some things that God delights in. It's not an exhaustive list, though. But let's look at some of the things this wealthy, aristocratic, privileged woman did in Proverbs 31. Elise, would you read verse 27 for us?
Yes. She watches over the activities of her household and is never idle.
Okay. What translation is that?
CSB.
CSB. Perfect. So the question here is, what does it mean to examine or watch over the activities of her household? How have you heard this verse interpreted, Elise?
Again, it goes back to where I was when I was being taught this verse. I think as a kid, I was very much taught that it was like an overseer. So kind of the one that's making sure that all the balls stay in the air.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and kind of directing the activities. Whereas then, as a student under complementarian teaching, it was very much she takes whatever her husband gives her and then is responsible for those little moving pieces, but
Okay.
only under the direction of her husband.
Okay. And household, especially with the complementarian teaching, was focused on like the nuclear family,
Yes.
taking care of
Husband,
babies,
wife,
cooking,
children. That's it.
cleaning, laundry. That's it. So this verse for complementarians was often interpreted, she's examining the activities of her household. She is up on her dusting and her laundry and her cooking and her homemade bread and her babies and homeschooling and all of those nuclear family household caretaking things. In the ancient world, since the home was the economic center, it is business and house and living space all intertwined. There was zero business outside the household. So the woman of valor's role here is that of chief operating officer, kind of like you were taught as a kid. She is looking over the affairs of those working in her domain. So in my lecture on YouTube, I break this down in more detail, but the patriarch of the family would be over the men in the family. And that could be sons, that could be maybe some unmarried brothers, that could be servants. He would be over the men directing what they do. And then the matriarch would be over the women. So as the woman of valor is examining the activities of her household, she's paying attention to her domain. There were gendered activities. The men typically did a certain type of work and the women typically did a certain type of work. And each of them would kind of watch over the people in their gender category to help make sure. So she's not necessarily doing all of the labor herself. She's
Sure.
watching to making sure everything's running smoothly, like a business manager, because a household was business. There, you can't
Mm-hmm.
separate it. My household is not a business.
Mm-hmm.
It is a house. It is a place of safety and leisure and eating. Their household was business. So the woman of valor's role is to watch over and make sure everybody's doing what they need to do. And some of what her specific categories that a woman would often be in charge of in a household in the Old Testament. And she had authority over these. It was not delegated to her by her husband. The culture said the matriarch has authority over these things. Even against her husband, sometimes if there was a disagreement, her word was often law on any of these areas. And so those areas are food. She could even decide whether her husband got seconds or thirds at a meal. If she said that is the rations for today, even if he wanted more, tough luck, dude. She's in
Mm-hmm.
charge of the food. So she had authority over food, light, when they lit the lamps at night. Imagine, Elise, that you get to decide every time somebody in your house flips a light switch on or off, or what time we turn off all the lights at night, and that's just it. The lights are off now. We're not turning them back on.
Mm-hmm.
She has authority over food, light, medicine, reproduction, and textiles, clothes, everything people wear. Those are her areas. So this passage of examining the activities of her household is not talking about just running your kids to soccer practice or dusting or vacuuming. The view here is not managing a home like we think of it. It's overseeing her responsibilities in the family business, which is intertwined with day-to-day living.
Which changes the view so much. I mean,
Mhm.
it opens it up to so much more.
Yeah. And many of the tasks we associate with homemaking, such as cleaning, childcare, and homeschooling, were not necessarily divided down gender lines in the Old Testament. Unless the child was nursing, which obviously only its mother could
Mm-hmm.
do, then older kids were with their gendered parent learning the economic processes of the house for what they would be doing as they grow up. So she's not educating children alone. She's not cleaning alone. She's not taking care of children alone. A lot of the things that we say, this is what a homemaker does, cleaning, childcare, homeschool, education, was actually split between the genders in the ancient world.
Yeah, and we can totally see that in verse 14 and 15 of Proverbs 31 and verse 21. I'll read those. I'll do 14 and 15. She is like the merchant ships bringing her food from far away. She rises while it is still night and provides food for her household and portions for her female servants. And then verse 21, she says, she's not afraid for her household when it snows, for all in her household are doubly clothed.
So the woman of valor is making sure everyone in the household had what they need. After studying the lives of the average peasant Old Testament woman, what I find really interesting in this passage is that she does not participate in food production at all. The Proverbs 31 woman. The average peasant woman would spend, I forget the exact figure, but it's like 2 to 4 hours a day grinding grain.
Which is crazy.
I know. I mean, 2 to 4 hours a day grinding grain. The Proverbs 31 woman isn't doing that. She is sourcing her bread externally. This is like a huge flag of like privilege, massive wealth and privilege here. She may be overseeing some of the food preparation, but she is not personally participating in it. She sources and manages the food to make sure the people in her household have food, and that it's being proportioned and everything appropriately, but she's not doing the labor. She's managing and she's overseeing the other women and servants doing these tasks. So it's not a mom with 5 little elementary school age kids. She is a grown woman. And by the time this was written, we might be thinking an elderly woman overseeing her daughters-in-law, and her servants to do the food production of the house, to do the storage, to do the maintenance of the food, and all of those things.
Yeah. And for peasant women, they would be doing this as a community often. So you wouldn't be grinding your wheat by yourself with your kids going crazy. You might be able to go grind your wheat with your friend and take turns and be building community, or with your sister, even within your home, because they lived in larger home things. So you might be working with your sister or sister-in-law to get this stuff done. So your youngest sister might be watching the kids while you do all of this together.
Yeah.
Which goes back to how parenting and being a stay-at-home mom is isolating. Your informal polls. Can you remind us of that?
Yes. A while back, this is quite a while back, I did a poll about whether women feel like being a stay-at-home mom was isolating. 63% of the participants voted that they found being a stay-at-home mom today in modern society extremely isolating. 20% said they felt like they actually had more community as a stay-at-home mom, which makes sense because there's some like homeschooling groups and whatnot. 12% were pretty sure that if they were a stay-at-home mom, they weren't, but if they were, that it would be isolating, which is one thing that really struck me as I studied women of the Old Testament, because I had heard so many voices like Patterson and Merkel and Pearl saying a woman needs to be in her home. Beware of other women. You don't want to be gossiping. You don't want to be hanging out with other women. Don't go join those liberal community feminist groups. Like, you need to be at home with your kids. That is your job. That is what God designed for you to do, to be home alone with multiple children all day, every day. That is God's plan for your life.
Oh my goodness.
That's what these women are teaching.
Yeah.
And to study through Proverbs 31 and the life of Old Testament women and realize these women were never doing any of this alone.
By themselves.
Never by themselves. They were constantly grinding grain together, baking bread together, doing weaving or anything related to yarn production together. They were constantly building community. And the Proverbs 31 woman is overseeing and helping and creating beautiful communities Carol Meyer, in her chapter in the book Biblical World of Gender, talks about the relationships these women would build during work and how significant they are. A lot of the women's books that I have read recently from complementarian perspective really downplay women in communities. They say women are just gossips, that they can't be trusted with each other, or that they will be tempted into liberal feminist causes. But in the ancient world, women being together was exceptionally important. Carol Meyer says these relationships among women at work were hardly casual or frivolous. Women's familiarity with each other builds solidarity. Women who work together typically rally to each other's assistance. They formed what we might call mutual aid societies. Their work together served an important social function in ancient Israel by contributing to the well-being and survival of their communities as well as their families. And she talks further, I don't know if it's in that book or one of her plethora of other writings, about how just important the women's community building in the ancient world was. Because a lot of the tasks that men did were isolated. They would be out in the field fixing a fence or taking care of the sheep or going out by themselves because they're men. They're a little safer to do that in a culture where you have no police, no standing army. Raiders can come through at any point. You need your women to stay physically safe. The men are a little safer to go by themselves. Some hotshot teenager isn't going to come upon you by yourself and like do something you don't want them to do. But women stay together. So in the ancient world, men often would go off by themselves to do their work. Women would work in groups. So it was the women's social relationships that were really, in many ways, the bedrock of the communities, because it was the women's who knew that the Smiths, their crops weren't doing well and they were going to need some extra help, or that the Thompsons, the husband is sick. And so our teenage boy can go over and help them. And it's the women who kept tabs on all of this. And now it's almost flipped. My
Forming the
husband,
network work that allowed all these transactions that needed to happen.
And I've just found it interesting as I was analyzing culture. Now, my husband has all of these social relationships at work. He's really well known. He's really well liked. People, he has all of these relationships at work. And then me, as a stay-at-home mom, it was me and the kids all day. And I would try to get together with friends, but that wouldn't always work. And you're trying to talk and and even if you're trying to talk, there's no one to watch the kids. So you're having to watch the kids the whole time. And I've just found the shift that with the industrialism shift to nuclear families, that to be very interesting how it used to be the women built these solid social relationships that were the bedrock of the community. The Proverbs 31 woman we see, and we'll talk about it more in a later episode, she's really creating these relationships and helping, and all of the tasks that the women under her watch, that she is examining the activities of her household, includes watching, facilitating, make sure the women in her community and in her household are able to use the communal oven, grind grain together, use the looms, who needs what. She's managing, potentially working with other women to manage multi-household usage of, it's like if three houses on my community resources, like like my mom or my grandma talk about a time where if you wanted to use the phone, you had to go down the hallway in your apartment building to the phone that 50 apartments all used the same phone. Or when I was in college, we had one washing machine for the entire dorm, or there was 4, but we had one washing room for the entire dorm and everybody. So you had communal resources. And so the woman of valor examining the activities of her household is helping to manage these communal resources for her household and other households to build these communities of women working together with each other's children to create this beautiful mutual aid society where they are not alone. They are not trying to just figure out their own house and their own kids by themselves.
So it talks about, Proverbs 31 talks about feeding and clothing people. And sometimes as a stay-at-home mom, it feels like that's all I do. I can never catch up on laundry. Um, I am always having to think about what the next meal is.
Mhm.
What are some ways that are similar and ways that are different to the woman of valor in Proverbs 31?
So you are right. A lot of in the old ancient world, a woman was still doing clothes and food. Like it seems like women have always been clothes and food. But there's a couple big difference. One of the biggest differences, it's not about the tasks that the women are doing themselves. It's about how those tasks are viewed. In the ancient world, the woman's tasks are necessary for survival and for wealth building. Today, a stay-at-home mom's tasks can be helpful for money management, but they lack the scope and necessity that the ancient woman's did. And the ancient woman then had more agency and power because their tasks were necessary. Where today, the scope of what a stay-at-home mom does is a lot less in some ways.
More narrow for sure.
We've outsourced a lot of the things. Like now, food. Like, yes, home cooked scratch meals are fantastic and healthier and all the
Mhm.
things. Not knocking that at all. I cook those meals every day. You do too. Um, but if I were to pass away tomorrow, my family would still be fed.
Mhm.
There's grocery stores, there's fast food. Today, if somebody can't feed themselves, it's either a lack of money, but it's not a lack of skill. In the ancient world, food production and textile production, clothing, these were very skilled, technologically advanced, proprietary technologies that the women knew. They were It's like the women knew how to bake the bread, the women knew how to make the clothes, the men didn't
Mhm.
necessarily. So you have this proprietary knowledge around these things that gave them honor, that gave them prestige in their community because it was necessary and it was highly skilled labor. Today, food production, clothing production is largely outsourced and considered less skilled labor, so it's devalued.
Mhm.
In the ancient world, a woman was the doctor for her family. Today, you take your kids to the doctor, um, and light, we just take light for granted. We don't have to worry about, do I
Yeah.
have enough oil to burn the lamp as long as I need to? We just flip on a light switch. And our husband, actually, if he's the provider for the homemaking and you're at home, he manages all of that with the money. So though women are doing many of the same things, the necessity and the valuing culture-wise is a lot lower for the women today. And even in the complementarian tradwife circles where they try to build up the woman, like, yay, being a mom is the most important job in the world. Even then, she's supposed to do this job without intrinsic authority
Mhm.
because
Yeah.
her husband in complementarian circles and hierarchical complementarian circles, he has all the authority. He is the head of the home. And so anything that she does, he delegates to her. She has no intrinsic power. She just has
Mhm.
delegated responsibility from his power. And so where
Mhm.
her work is meaningful and important, there's just some major differences on how it functions. One thing I also think of is today, a stay at home mom doing the homemaking, stay at home wife mom thing is completely dependent on her husband's economic function. In the Old Testament, the husband was as dependent on the wife as she is on him.
Mm.
Um, and sure, today husbands really appreciate having their laundry done and food done, and they depend on their wives for those things. But there's also fast food and laundromat and dry cleaners, and you can pay somebody to do that task very easily. But in the ancient world, if he didn't have her, he's scrounging like, how do I even make bread?
Mhm.
And
And
can I?
vice versa.
Yeah, they're
They were dependent on each other, which gives the woman some powers, maybe the wrong word, but it gives her value as a person for what she can do because he needs her just as much as she needs him. Whereas nowadays, it puts it can put women in a very precarious position.
And we see that a lot with abuse and whatnot, because a lot of women stay in abusive situations because they don't know where else to go. And they don't
Mm-hmm.
have any financial resources. In the ancient world, things like dowries, if the wife left or was divorced, she would often take that with her. And her economic function gave her value in the home. And so there's this mutual dependence. And I think it was Carol Myers again, or a similar author, who talked about how in a lot of early societies, because women would take raw materials and turn them into something that you could actually use, that was viewed almost mystically. Like women just had these like mystical, magical powers that they could turn like a sheep into a coat. That's amazing. They can turn these hard grains into bread. This is incredible. Like it was viewed really like, whoa, this is a great
Yeah.
skill. Whereas today we're like, yawn, big whoop, you
Mm-hmm.
cooked a meal. Where's my next set?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because food is so readily available, we just devalue it.
Mm-hmm. So, what can we learn then from Proverbs 31 about women's role in the home and the workplace? If you could kind of concentrate it down, what can we learn for us today?
We can learn that it is scriptural for a woman to have an economic function. We see in the Bible women having economic functions in their homes all the time. There is no shame, zero shame in a woman making money
Mm-hmm.
and having a job of some kind. The idea that the man is to be the breadwinner and the woman should not be a provider is completely inaccurate, both to the text and the ancient cultures. Both men and women were economic agents in the ancient culture. The idea that man is to be the provider does not match the Bible, does not match the
Mm-hmm.
ancient cultures. The woman was as much a provider as the man was. They both were providers working together. And so to have homes and families and marriages where both the husband and wife provide, however you decide to structure that,
Mm-hmm.
is fine. It's God is not giving us a decree on what somebody should or should not do. Complementarians say the Bible says a woman should not be the primary breadwinner earning money. She needs to be in the house doing housework. That isn't actually what scripture says. A woman having an economic function, working as a team with her husband, whether she earns 5%, 0.1%, 0%, 30%, 80% of their
Mm-hmm.
finances, percentages don't necessarily matter, but they're to work together as a team for the good of their household. And if she chooses, they choose that she's going to stay home and he's going to earn all the money, that's fine. I've done that for
Mm-hmm.
years.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's a totally acceptable way to do that if that's what works best for the family, but it is not a decree by God. So if
That's
the
so
husband and
important.
wife feel like, hey, she should go out and she should earn most of the money because she has the skills for that and he'll stay home,
Mm-hmm.
that's okay too. Or if they both go out and earn about the same amount or however you do percentages, scripture's focus for men and women is unity, them working together for the good of the family. And so we are allowed to be creative according to the needs of our family and the gifts and desires of the husband and wife in a married family, to be creative in how they do that. And when you're dealing with widows or single women, there is no shame in being a widow or a single woman who's working. A woman having a job and working is not shameful. Women had economic functions up until, I would have to look at all the history, but until sometimes in the 1900s, when
Mm-hmm.
suddenly they wanted women out of the factories so that I believe men coming home from World War I or II could take those jobs. So they created this whole housewife idea and tried to get women out of the factories so men could work. And
Mm-hmm.
until then, women had economic functions, unless you're very, very rich, and we're not talking about them.
Yeah, that's so good. And then my favorite part of every podcast, what does this text show us or reveal to us about God's heart? What can we learn?
I feel like there's just so much. God has created women to be beautiful, creative women who can use their gifts in so many ways to benefit their their world and their community outside of their home. Do we benefit our homes? Absolutely. Should we work at benefiting our homes? Absolutely. Does that mean we can only be in our house, only benefiting our nuclear family? No.
No.
I was thinking recently about how much my family needs working women. If complementarian ideal that women be stay-at-home moms suddenly was national and all the women that I and all the women I know are suddenly stay-at-home moms, my children would have no teachers. They would have no occupational therapists. They would have no therapists. They would have no speech therapists. They would have no pediatrician. They would have no dentist. Everybody taking care, doctors, dentists, therapists, all of it. It's all women. And these are incredibly necessary roles. And God delights in women using their interests and gifts for the good of their community, not just their home. And for those of us who were raised, especially those of us who grew up as little girls, being told, some more blatantly than others, your brother can be whatever he wants to be when he grows up within moral boundaries. He can be a doctor. He can be a lawyer. He could be president. You only have one option. You get to be a mom. Well, I'm not interested in kids and I don't want to be a mom. Too bad. It's God's will for your life that you are a mom. And if you don't want to be a mom, you better pray about that because you are in sin. And I just want, for those who grew up kind of with that idea that as a woman, you are limited to homemaker and that is your box and you don't have a choice, that in our modern society, God is not giving men freedom to follow their gifts, abilities, and interests and limiting women. He is saying he is calling both men and women to creatively, cooperatively see how their gifts, abilities, and interests can be used first for the kingdom of God, secondly for their family, and thirdly for their communities to benefit and serve the people around them. None of us are to be out there with all the ambition, just looking to make ourselves great. We're here to serve God and others, but we can do that in so many varieties of ways, and we are free to do that while loving our families well if we have families. And if we don't have families, if we are single, that is not shameful because God did not design you. He did not call all women to be homemakers, moms, so that if you're not a homemaker mom, you're a failure. God called you to be a daughter, to be a son, a legal heir, son of God. That is what we are. We are children of God. That is what we are called to be. Whether we get to be a mom, whether we get to be a wife, whether we are single, whether we have a job, whether we are a homemaker, that is lesser. We are called to be daughters of God. And we have freedom to live the rest of our life towards that end with creativity and passion and joy, not cooped up in little boxes or feeling like we're absolute failures because we haven't reached a list of extra biblical checklists on what we're supposed to be doing.
I love that. That's so encouraging.
Well, thank you so much for tuning in and listening to this episode on the Woman of Valor's home. Next episode, we were going to talk about her businesses. So we're going to talk about her work in more detail, and the fact that she had 3 businesses she was doing. This is a very industrious woman in a multitude of ways. We will be back to talk about that in a couple weeks. Can't wait to discuss that with you more. May God bless. Thank you for listening to the We Who Thirst podcast. A complete bibliography of the research behind this episode is available at wewhothirst.com. If you would like the full show notes, an opportunity to discuss each episode in a safe Discord chat, or simply to support this ministry, visit our Patreon. I am so thankful and am honored to have had you here with me for this episode. Until next time, remember, Jesus is the living water, and it is we who thirst.